All right. Thank you so much. So, yeah, this is a recording of a talk I gave at Baruch College at CUNY yesterday on March 17th at this Ethics of AI symposium. I mean, so this is ongoing work, and this is only like a 10-minute presentation, so it'll be like a super high level stuff. But the idea here is to firstly, okay, give you a sense of like what work we have been doing in this space and trying to set the stage around these are the different variables, this is what is happening, and give you a very short sneak peek of like some of the results that we've been working on. We have a lot more analysis now. Like I have a paper that I've yet to like finalize, but it's almost there. So the anyway, I'll get to it at the end. So basically, we've been seeing these sorts of headlines around, AI and energy use as a big thing that's gonna, impact all of us, in the households. And headlines like this. So the AI explosion means millions of people are paying more electricity. And there's, you see this all the time. Like, so I keep getting these sorts of headlines everywhere. So in Bloomberg, Yahoo Finance, Tech Policy Press. This is just a sample, but the idea here that many of these people are claiming to be is that there are these data centers being built, and there is, an increase in electricity cost. So, the AI data centers are causing your electricity bills to increase. So here in this project, like we want to really answer the causal question. Like, so we want to understand whether the increase, in building of these data centers is actually causing your electricity prices to go up. But before we go into like answering that question, like let's look at some challenges. Like, I mean, there's a lot of background around how the electricity grid works and what that means for our the price of electricity that we get. And I think that will help us clarify like some of these things on how the data centers might or might not affect your electricity prices. So there are four reasons why this is a very hard problem to study, and some of them are direct reasons why this is hard to study. Some of them are like these sorts of indirect challenges in studying this problem. Let me go through it one after the other. The first one is this is an interconnected market. The US grid is extremely dependent and interconnected. And because the power sourcing is centralized, so there's this thing called PJM, which is an interconnection. It's just a facilitator which buys power from the providers. So, there's a solar farm that is set up in rural Ohio, for instance. So they procure power and then sell it to these local providers. And PJM is this sort of 13-state consortium which does this sort of auction and makes sure that the availability is there and things like that. And so and these 13 states in the Northeast form this PJM interconnection. So even if there are many data centers being set up in Virginia, it'll impact things in New Jersey because this is a common market and they're all participating in the same auction. There's the same pool of power they're getting power from and things like that. So these are the grid providers. So, Texas and California and New York have their own grid. The rest are all in these sorts of consortium. So PJM is the largest one in terms of population served. So it's 13 states starting from, Illinois and going down until like North Carolina. And there's, a lot of these New Jerseys in there, Pennsylvania, Maryland, all of that. The big states are in there. Virginia is the big data center capital. So because of that, like there's this sort of interdependence. So you cannot really say that, oh, there are lots of data centers being set up in Virginia. Even if that's the case, the bills in New Jersey are going to increase. The second is, again, like this is a very big deal that is underplayed a lot, is that the electricity prices have been going up even before the data center boom. Right? Like, and this is a significant increase that we've seen over the last 5 years that we don't necessarily think about. But now that the data center boom has come in, like we attribute it to it immediately. But this is data from the census that is, we didn't have a census in 2020, but going back 10 years, looking at the average price of electricity across the nation, and we have data for like 25 states, and it's very similar trends. So there's this sudden increase in prices in 2020, 2021, and that is mainly because of various things like supply shocks, like COVID, Ukraine war, like bad timing for like retiring a lot of the coal-powered plants or nuclear-powered plants. Many people starting to get moved to EV, things like that. Like there's a lot of different causes for this, but there's this steady increase and like a significant increase, like 20% increase or so over the last 5 years. And so this is a huge component of that. Like so, we are not seeing something that is very, very sudden because of data centers. A lot of this is also historic. So there's this sort of 3% growth across time, but also this sort of 20% sudden growth in the last 5 years or so. So that people should account for. Third one is it's not a reason why it's hard to study, but it's also an argument that we can make about why data centers are not necessarily a bad thing, even if they increase your power bills in the short term. This is because most of our infrastructure in the US, electricity infrastructure, goes back to 25, 30, 50 years even, and it's aging, and it really requires a lot of like investment into it. So there's this report every year. The American Society for Civil Engineers give this sort of report card for various things infrastructure. And energy is always, C, D range. Like, I was checking these reports going back 10 years, 2013. We still had a C grade back then. Now it's D plus. And they claim that there's around $5 trillion of investment needed to fix the grid and make it modern, make it future proof and things like that. And I think data center demand is a good shock to the system, where now a lot of these data center companies, out of like to avoid the public backlash, are pledging to say that yeah, we will fund our own infrastructure costs. So if your new infrastructure or modernizing the infrastructure of the data, the electricity that goes to a data center is now, claimed to be subsidized by, companies like Microsoft or Anthropic or, some of these big hyper scalers. So hopefully, that kind of supply shock, hundreds of billions of dollars these people are putting into construction of data centers, some of that will go into the modernizing our grid, which is really required. But obviously, this will also mean that we are going to pay a bit more in the shorter term. That will pay off in the longer term. Again, like if you pay $20 a month extra, it's going to last for like your 50-year investment. So that's kinds of things that we do anyway all the time. So this is something that needs to be done anyway. And I think data centers are the positive there. The final thing, again, this is not a very clean, direct relation to why it's hard to study, but it's this sort of like very uh, complex reasoning here. So, and I'll get back to this at the end, but the idea here is that uh, this is like data center issue right now is at this very critical phase where there is no knowledge of what data centers are in the mass public. There's still, it's very concentrated. And there was a recent study done by Politico on this, which showed that there is little to no opposition on this, right? Like, so here, it's a large representative survey. It shows that, 70% of the people surveyed really didn't mind or don't care, like, about creating a data center. So it's again not super there's no big backlash against this. Even the people who are willing to have a data center set up, like or not set up, like they will are willing to pay like $15-20 to have a data center because it has these economic incentives and all of that stuff, which may not happen, but people have those sorts of thoughts. But the problem is like these perceptions have not yet been shaped by partisanship, and this will change really soon. Like, so this is a very complex argument, but the idea here is that right now we can still make choices around these data centers which are grounded in reality and in science and in like the data. But as soon as this becomes a partisan issue, like with anything in the US, any political issue, And this is fast becoming, AI data centers is fast becoming a political issue. There will be this sort of like really polarized view, which will make the debate on this and the discussion on this really just a political debate, right? Like, so people don't necessarily see through the value of what a data center will bring, what AI will bring. And if they just look at it as, this is anti-Trump or pro-Trump or, pro-Democrat, anti-Democrat, like I think that discussion become very complicated. Okay, so before we get into what our study is, like let's just very briefly give you a primer of how electricity billing in the US works. So there are three components for electricity, in your bill that you get. First is the power generation. Like so, there's someone generating the power. It's a coal plant, a gas plant, nuclear plant, solar, wind, whatever. A bunch of them are mixed together and then you get your power. You don't care about where you get your power, but that's only 50% of your bill. The bigger part, or like the second bigger part, is the transmission. So your local transmission company will take that power, transmit to you, putting out all the wires. If there's a storm, they maintain those wires, they upgrade those wires, they lay in new wires, all of that stuff. So that's around 35-40% of your bill. So this is moving electricity and like doing this sort of step up, step down, like making sure the power loss is taken care of, all of this stuff. Then the final part is the capacity, which is just this around 10% of your bill, 10 to 20%. But this is a very special case scenario, which is about reserving for peak demand. Like so there's these special days in peak summer, peak winter, where everyone has their air condition turned on, like it's really, really hot, like everyone is really using a lot of electricity, and the demands there are like really extreme. Like usually, the companies also budget for that and like, have to pay someone to say, hey, I'll provide this much amount of power for these particular few days. And that is very expensive, like because you have to like do this sort of auction and bid in advance for 2-3 years down the line. And there's this sort of competitive auction here happening. And so this is where like data centers primarily contribute. So the production and distribution are very standard, like, and like I said, like, now even like a lot of the companies are just pledging that the transmission distribution charges. So if you build a data center somewhere far away, and it requires laying of new lines, even though it might connect to some other town down the line, like the data center companies are promising that they're going to pay the transmission distribution cost of laying those wires, and it's not passed on to the end user. So that part is not the main effect. And again, like for generation, like in the US, like we have good sources of generation. Like it's not like, I mean, obviously, if you don't care about like the clean part of it, which right now in this administration we are not, it's a lot of it is, you can just generate a, gas power plant or a coal-fired plant and things like that. So that is also not a big deal. The bigger deal is the sort of capacity constraints, where you're, having this sort of market auction, and that's where there is, these data centers have a huge role. And this is where like there's this example of the PJM auction, like in 2024, on the average, there was this price, I think it's what's called a kilowatt hour price, is around $29 was the auction. And in 2025, so the auction for 2025 will happen in 2024. So they will say, okay, in 2025, I want to buy this much amount of power for these amounts of time. And so the auction price that went up like, 800%, like $270. Then it keeps going up like $329 for 26, 27. So this was again 2 years earlier, these auctions happen. And like because setting up this power, like so someone has to set up a solar farm and promise, and like there's a really complex way of integrating these, like so the power operator like PJM should make sure that it cannot just take in any solar power or any wind farm onto the grid. Like it has to make sure that the wires are capable of handling that, like, and there's enough infrastructure to handle like peak loads, non-peak loads, things like that. So there's a lot of that's happening. So anyway, so there's this capacity constraints are like capacity auction is where the actual prices might increase. And so in New Jersey, like the 20% increase is because of this. Okay, so finally, like let's get to what we are doing. So we have been looking at a lot of like different data sources. There's a lot of public data around this, but it doesn't answer the question, the causal question very clearly. But yeah, we're trying multiple sources. So one is this sort of using census data and the location of data centers to identify and study uh, like the impact of the presence of a data center. And then trying to do this more carefully using like individual bill donation, and then trying to do some sort of qualitative study of the user experiences close to a data center or not, and things like that. So, yeah, so I mean, this is still, I mean, this work, part of it is done, but like the other work is ongoing. So, yeah, if you have any comments or questions or suggestions, I think that'll be great. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer. So, the first study that we did is using locations of data centers. So, we know where the existing data centers are, where they're operating, when they were set up, when they started operations, and their zip code. We know also from census that uh, per zip code, the average electricity bill for that zip code. So we know, so then we can construct this sort of zip codes with data centers, zip codes without data centers, and try to get this sort of clean groups. So we got data for around 20,000 zip codes, the electricity prices from census. We got data, these are like 24 states where there are existing data centers, like some amount of existing data centers. We said like at least 50 data centers. And then we have this sort of like treatment control. So zip codes where there is a data center, we look at when it was operational, what was the price before, what was the price after. We have a control group, like where you do the same like before and after, and do this sort of difference in differences. The idea here is yeah, doing the sort of very clean setup. And again, like the treatment group here has a lot of data centers, like it's 2,500 data centers, and it's around like 500 zip codes or so. You really have decent amount of data. Uh, the finding is that there's no significant difference in terms of like causation. Like, so, data center being present doesn't really cause your electricity bills to increase. So the caveat here is that there are many caveats. One is this the presence of a data center, the where these are being set up, especially now, is not very open. Like, so there's a lot of tricks that people use, like, filing for, like, people file for permits for gas turbines, for, the backup electricity generation, like the generators to run, right? Like, I mean, the way these data centers operate is they have these power supply, but they have to be online all the time. So they have this automated sensors that detect whether there's some fluctuation in the power, and they have these backup sources that come in. And usually those are like some gas turbines, or some natural gas, or some other source that are, batteries or things like that. So based on that, like journalists have been able to figure it out. And like, so these 2,500 we have here is probably around 50% of the total data centers that are in the country. That's one part, like, so, we may be missing a big chunk of data centers, but that doesn't, because these data centers are concentrated in certain zip codes, like I think we are covering most of the zip codes, so that's not the bigger concern. The bigger concern is that this data is, we have it from 2014 to 2024, so around 10 years. Uh, but most of the peak usage, like setup and like coming online of these data centers, is happening now, like in 2024, 2025. So the 2024 census doesn't capture that. So I think we will start seeing the effects starting now, 24, 25, 26. So maybe that could be the reason. Like, yeah, so whatever data centers existed until 2022, 23 are not these hyperscalers. I mean, the madness of like these extremely large data centers, I think we're just starting to do that. We did not have that. Like, I mean, it was not this scale, so the impacts were not probably very modest. And we have like some effect, like it's not a significant effect, like it's around $2 or so. Significant at like P is 0.05. So not very strong, but not very, I mean, not a significant effect. But yeah, so that's the context here. So maybe if we redo this in like 1 year, or 2 years, I think this we might find a more significant effect. The other thing that we are doing now, and this, I mean, it's still not very well formulated, is so basically one of the concerns there, again, one other concern is that there's this lack of like averaging across zip codes will really like miss out a lot of details. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to like use this sort of data donation model, recruit people close to a data center, far away from a data center, controlled for various things like household size and like things like that, like various appliances. Do they have an electric car? Yeah, all of these kinds of stuff. And then do this. I think this might be a bit better. And I mean, it's obviously harder to scale, so we'll start this in New Jersey. But yeah, if you're interested in or have funding for this, like I'd love to really scale this up and do this at across the country. But that's the idea here. So this is ongoing. We don't know. And we'll also do some sort of more experimentation and following up, like, with qualitative studies of like, talking to people next to a data center. It's not just the electricity cost. Obviously, that's very important. And, these sorts of transmission costs, some companies are really shady and like they pass it on to the end user because of these local deals that we don't know. So it's a very complex story. So we don't know. And I think the qualitative study will probably bring up some of those kinds of concerns. Okay, so to summarize, like we don't have an effect right now, but that's because we may not be seeing the real data. I think that the data is coming, last year or this year, so that might be the thing. There's no effect. The effect might be in the future. The the bigger thing around like this balance of accountability, like okay, these data centers need to take some of the load, right? Like, so they cannot pass on like increased electricity bills to people like us. So there needs to be some accountability, but that doesn't mean that the data centers or AI usage is a bad thing. Like, resisting AI, again, this is a very personal and polarized take. Like, I don't believe that, resisting AI or saying, I don't want data centers or nobody's asking for these AI tools. I don't think that's the future that we want. At least I don't want that. I think there is a lot of potential value here. So I think these two could work in tandem. And like there are models like where now Microsoft is promising this sort of taking care of these distribution and capacity charges. Anthropic has made the same pledge. So having some sort of norms around that, having some sort of laws around that, like again, like in New Jersey, there's very good high common sense laws on data centers. Okay, you should bring your own water. You should put it in a place where the water can be recyclable, like things like that, like which are very, very common sense based. So those kinds of things are possible, but that is related to my next point. Is this sort of common sense based policy is going to really very soon not happen. Like that's because this issue is getting polarized very soon. And once that happens, people will lose touch with this common sense thinking and like really tie into their own tribes. So, data centers are a progressive cause. So, data center is bad, or data center is good because it's, pro-Trump or whatever. So that is going to happen, like which I really hope it doesn't, but it's going to happen soon. And I think a lot of these companies are foreseeing that sort of pushback and trying to pledge all of these because of that. And yeah, we need like causal evidence here, and I think some of these approaches are helpful there. I really hope like we can do more than what we've already done. But yeah, if you're interested in this space, let me know. Yeah, thank you, and I'll stop here.